Chapter 71 Golden Boy. You are listening at novelfull.audio. All throughout Horus, players were shocked at the server announcements. Apophis already had some notoriety, but this major event was still out of the ordinary. Some saw Apophis as the new golden boy of the MMORPG world, someone who was rising from obscurity to become the 8th legendary player of the MMORPG world. All the media began talking about the Eclipse Guild, which, of course, no one knew anything about. Many players immediately applied to join it, wanting to get into the guild in its earliest stages. Caesar, who was about to do a dungeon in nightmare mode, also received the double notification. He couldn't believe it. Nightmare mode was already incredibly difficult, even for him. And yet Apophis had just beaten Ironman mode, one that must be even harder, and with the potential penalty of losing all your game progress. This was an incredible feat in the MMORPG world, and Caesar was totally disgusted. He wanted to try the Ironman mode himself, but his guild leader formally forbade him. However, soon after the double announcement, Caesar received an interesting message from his guild leader. As Caesar had proven himself over and over, the guild council had elected to send Caesar on a mission to chase Apophis down and claim the bounty on his head for Renovatio Imperii. And Caesar wasn't alone. All the big guilds, bounty hunters, and even just greedy players set out at once to hunt down Apophis, who now had a bounty of 15 million GC on his head. 10 million GC had been offered by the game, of course, and 5 million GC from the collective players who saw Apophis as a traitor. In real money, that was worth about 40 million credits, a considerable sum. Of course, for many, the money was nothing compared to the glory of killing the most famous and hated player in all of Horus. The media added a lot of fuel to the fire, declaring Apophis to be Master of Horus. There was a lot of mindless talk about how the 7 gods had peaked and were no longer relevant. Of course, this sparked countless debates on the forums. At the end of the dungeon, Apophis and his group were busy distributing the final boss's loot while everyone outside argued on the forums. The loot was amazing, of course. Staff of the Prophetess, Esper/Hunter, Legendary, Item Summary. It emits the faintest sound of celestial music. Staff of the Prophetess of the God of Truth. Effect. Doubles all damage activated ability. Summon a shield of light that absorbs 90% of all damage for 20 seconds. Requirements. Alignment above 1000. Well, that certainly disqualified Apophis, but it was very good news for White. As a huntress, she was the only one in the group who could use it correctly. The rest of the loot was also impressive. There were several epic pieces of armor and rare weapons and potions, which were distributed equally among the group. While everyone was discussing loot, an eye emerged from a black puddle on the ground. It was Enklabasa in his physical form. Thanks to you all, I have recovered 1/10 of my soul. I am deeply grateful to you for everything. Notification. Step 1 of your quest, Resurrection of Enklabasa, completed. Reward. 100 skill points plus 1 legendary skill for your class plus 1 million GC. This was an extremely generous reward. While everyone else was raving and spending their skill points, Apophis received his legendary skill. Demonic Wing, Dark, Legendary, Skill Summary. Demonic wings sprout from your back, revealing your inner darkness. All creatures of negative alignment gain respect for you. Gain a damage reduction bonus by folding your wings, scales with STR. Gain a flying speed in both atmosphere and vacuum, scales with AGI. Can be used as melee weapons, damage scales with STR. The next moment, a special notification appeared. Rank B achieved. Chapter 72 Mutation. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Apophis had finally reached rank B. This was incredible. Even the next most powerful player would have barely reached C. Apophis's lead in power was truly absolute. It was time to exit the dungeon, but just as everyone prepared to leave, Apophis fell to the ground and screamed in pain. His team stopped immediately. Chocolate immediately prepared to purge him of the debuff she assumed had been cast on him. But on the ground, Apophis knew perfectly well what had happened. This had been known to occur in his original life, but only rarely, when a character made such a dramatic change in a short period that they were permanently altered. Killing the divine child had caused his alignment to collapse like a black hole, and it would have very painful consequences. Your alignment has triggered a chaotic mutation. Apophis's perfectly white skin now turned dark gray. His beautiful eyes shifted, their purple irises warping around pupils that were slits, like those of a snake. Curls of red energy appeared around his eyes and all over his body, searing his skin for a moment despite his mastery of fire. The other party members were amazed. What was going on? Chocolate was targeting Apophis with her strongest restorative skills, but nothing was happening. Lotus, worried sick, buried her head in her arms and shouted, "What's happened to you? Apophis, answer me." Asterisk mutation completed. You gained the race, fallen Zetark. Asterisk the pain stopped. Though they often came because of huge influxes of power, mutations were not considered good things in his old life. They seemed to be downgrades as often as they were power-ups. Apophis had heard of more than one character being rendered useless after mutating. It was commonly known that allowing your alignment to get too high or too low would trigger a mutation, so most players tried to prevent this. In fact, it was common to keep alignment as close to neutral as possible. After pulling himself back up from the ground, Apophis said a few words to reassure his friends, then called up his character menu. Name: Apophis, Bounty. 15 million GC Soul. Enclabasa, Guild. Eclipse, Leader, Race. Fallen Zetark, Evolution LVL. 3, Mutated, Next Evolution. LVL 50, Gender. Male Class. Esper LVL 26 Rank. B, Space Warrior, Alignment Point 2000, Darkness, Stats. STR, Strength. 400, plus 10%, x2 equals 880 INT, Intelligence. 400, plus 10%, x2 equals 880 AGI, Agility. 400, plus 10%, x2 equals 880 DX, Dexterity. 400, plus 10%, x2 equals 880 Dark Energy. 5000, plus 50%, x2 equals 15,000 Luck. 1 times 2 is equal to 2. Global Skill. Book Skills. Berserk, Cosmic Materialization, Dark Cosmic Meditation, LVL2, Demonic Wing, Eternal Flame, LVL3, Lord of Flames, Susanoo, Zoanthropy Talent Tree Skills. Energy Regeneration. 15 PTS, Firebending. 50 PTS, Telekinesis. 10 PTS, Waterbending. 25 PTS Passive Skills. Archaeologist, Ghost, Inventory. Equipment. Zetark Nobility Uniform, Epic, God Sencha's Rings of Power, Legendary, Complete Zetark Battle Armor, Rare, Ring of the God, Emperor Apophis, Common, Money. 2,013,000 Galactic Coin Summary. Congratulations! You've reached the power level of a space warrior and can now fight directly in the vacuum of space. Nevertheless, your incredible ascension comes only as a result of the suffering and the death that you spread in your wake. Your body is proof of your evil for all the galaxy to see. Well, that was certainly better than Apophis was expecting. This wasn't just a power-up, but a very good one. He had the strength of almost 9 ordinary men, and such an incredible amount of energy would allow him to activate Susanoo almost permanently. Of course, his appearance surprised him the most. Apophis didn't look like a Zetark at all anymore. Besides the graying of his skin and his snake eyes, the cracks which outlined his eyes emanated a distorting red light that was absolutely nothing like the normal appearance of a Zetark. Only Apophis's white hair and noble facial features remained as evidence of his base species. Beyond that, he looked like a true demon. And, of course, the huge bounty was astounding. Sure, it was common for famous players to have some kind of bounty on their head, whether from side quests with big consequences or from jealous players, but for all of that to happen at once and for it to be so staggeringly high was almost unthinkable. Since he had to rest for another moment before they could leave, Apophis decided not to put off spending his skill points. He had 100 of them, which was more than he'd ever seen at one time in his old life. Apophis's first thought was to upgrade Susanoo, which would use up all 100 points at once. Then again, did he really need to? He was already immensely powerful, probably close to hitting rank B even as he was. No, it would be a good idea to bolster different parts of his arsenal instead of just gaining so much raw damage in one skill. Apophis spent 50 skill points to improve his Lord of Flames skill. Dark Lord of Flames, Book Skill, Esper, Dark, Rare, Upgrade Rank. 1. Skill Summary. Gain perfect mastery of the flames around you. You can control all flames within 1,000 kilometers. You can teleport to any presence of flame within this range. This skill can be upgraded for 100 skill points. He spent the rest of his skill points on the Esper talent tree. 25 went to waterbending to match firebending since the combo had already been so useful in the dungeon. Apophis spent his last 25 skill points to power up energy regeneration. At last, the party teleported out of the dungeon. Over 300 of the Super Guild Hyrule's strongest players waited for them outside. Chapter 73 Warrior of Eclipse. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Apophis's group was in shock, not to mention exhausted after completing the dungeon. But their feelings didn't really matter. Nothing would change the fact that there was a small army in front of them. Most of the players from Hyrule were LVL 14 or 15, equipped with rare and epic Federation-style military equipment. No matter whether you looked at their skills or gear, these were truly elite players at the top of the game. A LVL 15 warrior named Ganon walked towards Apophis, cautious and surprised at Apophis's demonic appearance. But blinded by his arrogance because of the numerical superiority of the Hyrule players, Ganon stood arrogantly before Apophis and said, "Hello, Mr. Apophis. I'm Ganon, lieutenant of the Hyrule Guild. I've been charged by my guild leader to put you under arrest. Please follow us without resisting." All the gathered players knew the consequences of dying in PvP, losing a whole level, as well as GC and a piece of equipment. Now that they were so far along in the game, a single level was extremely hard to gain back. So, all the Hyrule players thought, their sheer numbers would surely intimidate such a pathetically small guild and force them to obey. No more running away. Apophis didn't bother answering. He materialized a sword of flame 3 meters long and planted it in Ganon's torso, incinerating him on the spot. In less than a second, all that remained was an epic item that fell to the ground where Ganon had once stood. The entire Hyrule army was stunned. Every one of them was fascinated by the impressive and lightning-fast attack. Even so, Apophis was the enemy, and Hyrule still had the numbers advantage. Both sides quickly formed into battle lines, summoning pets and charging up skills. Apophis ignored his party and simply spread his dark wings, leaping dozens of meters into the sky. He stretched out his arms and 100 black fireballs appeared which rained upon the battlefield like falling stars. Half the Hyrule players died in an instant, but Apophis wasn't done. He swooped down and unleashed savage attacks with his 3-meter flame sword, massacring the enemy and completely subjugating them with his raw power and aggression. For the few moments they remained alive, the elite Hyrule players could only think about how Apophis looked more like a demonic dungeon boss than a mere player. Hyrule's remaining players were completely disorganized, panicking at seeing their leaders and healers dying all around them. Their terror actually kept many of them alive as they ran in different directions and so evaded some of Apophis's AoEs that targeted their allies. Of course, Apophis wasn't the only terrifying danger. All the other members of Eclipse were far more powerful than they should have been, using unique skills nobody had ever seen before and killing Hyrule players almost without effort, despite having just exited an Iron Man dungeon. To Eclipse, who had just endured incredible difficulty and extreme anxiety, a mere 1,000 players of LVL 15 were nothing. They were 10 levels higher, except for Apophis, and none of these Hyrule players were as scary as a horde of Nagas. So, with their leaders gone and trying desperately to regroup, Hyrule's remaining members retreated. But just when the Eclipse players thought they'd get some respite, 5 corvettes with the Hyrule Guild emblem flew overhead and bombarded them with anti-personnel missiles. It was a totally unfair fight. Even LVL 25 players simply couldn't compete with spacecraft arsenals. Except for Apophis. He activated Susanoo, guarding his allies against the attack. Though they all survived, the force of the missiles exploding was so great that only Apophis's new energy reserves were enough to bolster Susanoo enough to protect them. The corvettes made another pass across the sky, sending another missile salvo down. Susanoo finally shattered, and Apophis fell to one knee, heavily wounded. But just as the corvettes turned for one last bombing run, the Mk.1 burst into the atmosphere at high speed and unleashed its weapons into one corvette. The other 4 corvettes swung in different directions, breaking out of their bombing run to engage the Mk.1 in an aerial battle. But the Mk.1 was not alone. 3 other corvettes appeared in its wake, each bearing the Federation military insignia. The military was here to support their agent against an assault by a rogue player faction. The fight turned quickly. The Hyrule players were still learning how to maneuver their ships in atmospheric flight. It was one thing to fly in a straight line and use a computer to fire targeted missiles, but to fight skilled Federation pilots was a completely different matter. The Federation corvettes were so dominant that the Hyrule ships retreated into space, and then the battle was over. The Mk.1 landed near Apophis and the other Eclipse members. Colonel Ralphit and Antanria soon exited the ship and trudged through the scorched and bloody sand to stand before Apophis. Apophis respectfully shook hands with Colonel Ralphit and said, "Thank you for your efficiency, Colonel. Your mission was successful." After evading Hyrule in the Lizardman station, Apophis had realized that they would probably catch up to the Mk.1 eventually again. So, he'd asked Colonel Ralphit to requisition some reinforcements as soon as they stepped foot in the dungeon. As it turned out, that had been a wise decision. The colonel answered, "You are welcome, Apophis. Please note that there was a complication. These men are special forces, as it would have been impossible to get ordinary troops into non-Federation space on such short notice. The Grand Admiral considered it a special favor, which he is calling in immediately. We are officially summoned to report to him for a mission." Well, if Apophis was going to owe a favor to such a calculating man as Azeroth, he supposed it was for the best to get it out of the way immediately. Far better than to have it hanging over him until Azeroth called the favor in as an unpleasant surprise. While the other players collected the items which the Hyrule players had dropped after their PvP deaths, Apophis turned to Antanria and hugged her affectionately. This surprised Antanria, as Apophis hadn't exactly been very tender before now. And now, he looked like a horrific demon, rather than looking like a Zetarch, just like her. But Apophis had endured much hardship during the dungeon. He'd been forced to sacrifice his humanity in order to return to Antanria in one piece. He promised himself that he would never act weak again by ignoring his fondness for the people in his life. Rather than being afraid of losing people close to him, and so avoiding getting attached to anyone, Apophis would simply grow strong enough that he never would lose them. He would live his life to the fullest, even if it meant embracing the darkness. Chapter 74 Retribution. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Once aboard the Mk.1, Apophis took command again. Though they would soon need to return to Grand Admiral Azeroth, Apophis would first send a message to Hyrule. It would be one of the stepping stones to writing his name and that of his guild in the MMORPG history books. In Horus, each planet had only one resurrection point, with very few exceptions, such as the starting planet of Taio. Even if a player died in space, they would reappear on the nearest habitable planet at its resurrection point. This mechanic led to one of the greatest abuses in video game history, the mass spawn kill. So long as you could trap your enemy in their graveyard and no one could stop you, you could simply kill them over and over, causing them to lose a level and an item each time. For many players, this led to total annihilation. It was, of course, harassment, but unlike many other MMORPGs, there was no system in Horus to prevent this from happening. The only way to combat it was to disconnect from the game and hope your enemy would be gone by the next time you logged on, but a determined and coordinated enemy could completely shut down your ability to play the game permanently. With all this in mind, and knowing that most of the Hyrule players would not have any experience with respawning on another planet, Apophis flew the Mk.1 towards planet Ashure's resurrection point. As they approached, part of the Hyrule army was already visible, having respawned. They seemed to be standing around and waiting for their allies to come back as well. In addition, 2 of the escaped Hyrule corvettes had regrouped here and were clearly preparing to pick up the humiliated players. This was Apophis's chance to send a message to every other guild in Horus. He began a live stream titled Eclipse Sanctions Hyrule. At the beginning, only a few people noticed it, but word quickly spread that the famous Apophis was streaming some guild business. Thousands of people quickly joined the stream, and in mere minutes, the view count had reached 100,000. And then Apophis began his assault. At Apophis's command, the Mk.1 and the Federation ships unleashed a barrage of bombs on the Hyrule corvettes parked on the ground. The respawn players were terrified and ran in all directions, but it was no use. Just as Hyrule had tried to bomb the players of Eclipse while they were helpless on the ground, so Apophis returned the favor against their own respawn members on the planet's surface. The carnage was so absolute that even his own crew members felt sorry for the slaughter, almost forgetting the unfairness Hyrule had just tried to use against them. Colonel Ralphit was very impressed by the resurrection power of the Eternals, of course. Despite all the bombing, the Eternals reappeared instantly on the ground again. He had witnessed this power on satellite feeds while orbiting planet Era, of course, but seeing it up close was truly incredible. Many more viewers joined Apophis's stream as the seconds passed, and soon more than 1 million people were eagerly watching this humiliation being dealt to one of the super guilds that made the game so frustrating for normal players. More than that, though, this was the first time many players had seen spacecraft being used in warfare. Players saw how much more power a single ship had compared to even an army of high-level players, and they quickly realized how valuable such weapons would prove to be as the game continued. On Ashur, the Hyrule players eventually realized that disconnecting was the only way to stop losing so many levels and items. One by one, they stopped respawning. Apophis was more full of rage with every passing moment, and seeing these players trying to outsmart him was infuriating. He used his new powers to set fire to the respawn point and the surrounding area for a vast distance, charring the few players still connected. He might not be able to destroy the respawn point itself, but he had the power of black flames now. So long as he still lived, they could never be extinguished, and any player who respawned on this planet would die over and never be free. The stream viewers didn't understand how Apophis's powers worked at first, but then people slowly began figuring it out as they realized Apophis wasn't having to spend any effort or energy to keep these flames active at such a vast distance. Shock filled the chat stream. Apophis had just declared war on a super guild containing several 100,000 members. As the power of the Corvette missiles had just proved, even one player's power simply couldn't compare to so many resources. Surely this was an insane thing that Apophis had just done. Millions of light-years away many people sat watching a giant screen which displayed Apophis's infamous stream. Many famous players were among them, including Zelda and Link, the leaders of Hyrule. Everyone bore the same serious expression. Link was in a terrible mood. His guild had just been publicly humiliated by a player who had, before the launch of Horus, been completely unknown in the MMORPG scene. However, some of this anger was also toward Zelda, who had asked him to give Apophis a beating to teach him some humility. As one of the 7 gods, what was he supposed to do? Refuse. And now look where that had gotten their guild. What would the shareholders think? But more practically, the other super guilds might take advantage of this sign of weakness. Perhaps they would openly attack Hyrule, and if even 2 other super guilds teamed up, Hyrule wouldn't be able to protect themselves. In most MMORPGs, wars between superguilds were extremely rare, as they usually weakened both sides. In fact, to ensure the dominance of the superguilds in MMORPG gaming, other superguilds often stepped in to help struggling superguilds not fall apart. However, if a superguild lost respect, their rivals had occasionally been known to annihilate it and then share the profits among themselves. Link couldn't do much to Zelda, so he'd need to make sure Apophis and his tiny eclipse suffered the full brunt of his wrath. Planet Ashur. As the MK.1 left the atmosphere and entered hyperspace, Apophis received a notification. Asterisk the player, Link, has placed a 100 million GC bounty on your head. Your current bounty is 115 million GC, asterisk. Chapter 75 Terra. You are listening at novelfull.audio. After the members of Eclipse were done on Ashur, the MK.1 sped through hyperspace and headed for Terra, the capital of the entire Federation and one of the most populated planets in the galaxy. During the trip, everyone rested in the ship's mess hall. They reflected on how the events of the last couple of days had been immensely difficult, but that couldn't keep the mood from being cheerful. While everyone else chatted, the Apophis and Lotus slipped into the crew quarters. Apophis, having a good 30 years of life experience, was quite skilled at seducing and making love to a woman. While the two were busy with each other, Antanria left the mess hall to use the ship's toilet. On her way, she heard the 2 lovers. Antanria was both very curious and just approaching adolescence for her species. She knew little about relationships between adults, but only what she had read in books and the shallow education she had received in her old life in the royal family. That education had done nothing to sate her curiosity, however, as it had focused more on what her duties would be when she one day married than anything else. Her own happiness was not exactly an important factor as far as her family was concerned. She certainly hadn't been taught anything about seduction. After a few minutes, White, on her own way to the ship's toilet while drunk, caught her eavesdropping and burst out laughing. This outburst interrupted the 2 lovers, making them freeze. Everyone else moved closer and asked White about why she had laughed. So as not to humiliate Antanria, White said, "Sorry, it's all the red whiskey's fault." Well, by the time they arrived, everyone was in a light-hearted mood. It was a good thing, because the actual arrival on Terra was difficult. The Federation was close to a state of all-out war with the Orc Empire, so Apophis had to ask special permission from the Federation army before they could enter the planet's atmosphere. Fortunately, Apophis had all the credentials of his military rank, not to mention Colonel Ralphot. After some communication, which felt like it took forever, Apophis and the ships which had assisted him on Ashur could break through the blockade. Through the MK.1's windows, hundreds of thousands of not-so-lucky ships could be seen waiting to be searched before they could enter. Once Apophis provided all their information, the operator replied, "Welcome to Terra, Major. The Grand Admiral has been informed of your arrival and has asked you to land on Military Platform 74. They entered the atmosphere. Terra was a planet of the Ecumenopolis type, a planet entirely covered by a single immense city with over 1 trillion inhabitants. It was, of course, one of the great prides of the United Federation of Planets. But Terra was, at the same time, an abomination for the human supremacists, due to being a cosmopolitan haven. Only 5% of the population was human, while the rest were xeno-species from all over the galaxy. The MK.1 landed on the military platform which had been pointed out. The party was quickly greeted by several officers and soldiers who gave them a fantastic ceremonial welcome with drums and music, truly worthy of an important personality like Major Apophis. Delighted by such politeness, the crew happily followed the chief officer, who guided them to a flying car. The luxurious vehicle led them to an enormous palace that rose a kilometer into the sky. The Chancellor's Palace. Hulk shouted, "Oh! Look over there." At the base of the palace, stretching across the cityscape as far as the eye could see, was a vast military parade of several million soldiers, war machines, and mechas. In the sky, battleships, cruisers, and hundreds of thousands of corvettes soared majestically. It was a genuine show of force, because all the ambassadors of the Galactic Council were present, including the Orc ambassador. Of course, this was nothing like the players had ever seen, and they were captivated by the incredible sight. The flying car landed under an overhang attached to the face of the immense palace. A new military officer greeted Apophis and Ralphit, then led them to a huge balcony where Grand Admiral Azeroth waited. Free seats awaited them, so Apophis and Ralphit sat and watched the glorious parade as it ended. Chapter 76 Preparation for War. You are listening at novelfull.audio. They were seated next to Grand Admiral Azeroth and Supreme Chancellor Soli. Of course, among the players, only Apophis knew the significance of these two, and what a great honor they had been shown. Of course, the honor given to Apophis and his group was not the primary consideration of the event. All the galaxy was watching recordings of this event and seeing Apophis and his guild seated in positions of honor. The Grand Admiral had arranged this to promote his own prestige, hoping to give the appearance that Apophis was working for him, that he had subjugated the man whom many throughout the galaxy were beginning to call the King of the Eternals. Azeroth himself knew Apophis was no king, but the value of such propaganda would help him immensely. He even hoped that it would make the Eternals themselves come to look at him with awe, as someone whom Apophis respected. The parade soon ended, and Grand Admiral Azeroth summoned Apophis, alone, to a private chamber. The two men stared each other in the eye without speaking for a long while. Eventually, the Grand Admiral yielded. "Your power, as an individual, to be precise, has increased considerably. Your aura is sinister, and your physique has become cold and powerful. What a fantastic advantage you Eternals have, to adapt and evolve so easily. I suppose you have me to thank for this newest form. The support I sent your way was instrumental in the success of your recent mission, correct?" Apophis gave a light smile. "It's true that your support contributed to my ascension. However, I think we both have each other to thank." Grand Admiral. "The events that took place on Era were obviously instrumental to your promotion, and I've heard a lot about how my former soldiers have been extremely effective in the first border skirmishes against the Orc Empire. Then, said the Grand Admiral, our collaboration has been profitable for both of us. It stands to reason that we should strengthen that collaboration. Don't you agree? At the moment, only 100,000 Eternals have integrated into the Federation army, almost entirely the number you led on Era. Meanwhile, more Eternals arrive on Era with every passing day. According to our intelligence sources, the number of Eternals has surpassed 300 million. Surely you see the problem, Apophis. Your people are a rising threat to the Federation, especially considering how few of you are joining the Federation army. Meanwhile, we also face the active threat of the Orc Empire. I cannot let your people endanger us, Apophis. Total war against the Orcs is coming and I want you to pledge your support in it. I need more men, and your people are formidable warriors. Their rapid progress, their fighting spirit, and above all, their immortality make you the most promising fighters in the galaxy. And I know the influence you hold over your people. Eternals may see you as a hero or an enemy, but regardless, they can't ignore you and the weight of your actions. That's why I need your help. Quest notification. Massive conscription, grade. Difficulty. A+, summary. Grand Admiral Azeroth asked you to convince 10 million players of at least LVL-10 to join the Federation army. Reward. Varies based on result. Possible promotion in the Federal Army plus many GC plus galactic prestige. Failure penalty. Loss of reputation with the Federation of the United Planets and with Grand Admiral Azeroth plus loss of status for players with the Federation. Time limit: 7 days. Apophis was shocked. That bastard Azeroth was watching them closely indeed, as the figure of 300 million players seemed accurate. Apophis remembered Azeroth's reputation from his first life. He realized that this mission was a perfect example of Azeroth's famous philosophy. The ends justify the means. But the part which surprised Apophis was the generosity of the quest rewards, especially the galactic prestige, a kind of reputation currency which was extremely hard to get and which would be useful all throughout the game. Even if the rewards hadn't been as good, Apophis wouldn't have had any option but to accept the quest. After all, he was a player. If the Federation started persecuting Eternals, Apophis's time in the game would get much harder. "I accept," he said. Azeroth stood up. "Good. This mission must remain secret, of course. Also, remember. Once they join the Federation, all Eternals will be under my command. Keep that in mind. Now, I have a war council I must attend. Please enjoy the feast." They both left the room and Apophis returned to his team. He took Antanria so they could get some rest, and kissed Lotus tenderly before parting. Terra, being one massive city stretched across the entire planet, was full of every decadence imaginable. Especially so close to the grandest palace on the planet, there were many luxurious hotels available. Between the 2,513,000 GC in his inventory and the 11,058,245 GC in the Eclipse Guild treasure, Apophis had more than enough to purchase whatever he desired. So it was time to experience a few of the comforts he deserved. Apophis decided to stay at the Royal Palace of Terra, one of the most renowned hotels in the entire game. It was famous for its exotic foot, spa and massage services, swimming pools, private jacuzzis, and luxury Xeno prostitutes. Apophis ordered an exotic limousine to pick him up, one that was fluorescent green, of all colors, for 10,000 GC. Sure, it was a waste of money, but he could easily afford it. The limousine arrived much more quickly than he'd expected, but Apophis didn't give it much thought. After all, he was paying quite a lot, so the service should be perfect. But as Apophis and Antanria climbed into the luxury car, the doors locked and a sleeping gas filled the air, rendering them both unconscious. Chapter 77 Trader. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Apophis woke up alone in a brightly lit room tied up from head to toe. He couldn't move an inch. Something immediately caught his eye: 2 huge automatic turrets and an advanced camera system pointing at him from above. The moment Apophis tried to escape, those weapons would unload their magazines in his direction. Sure, he would just respawn. But if he had been captured, so had Antanria. Who had captured them? Bounty hunters. Super Guild players, maybe from Hyrule. Or what if it was adherents of the gods, determined to punish him for killing the god of truth? But no matter how many options Apophis considered, there was no way for him to know. If he wanted to have a chance at saving Antanria, there was nothing he could do but wait. After about 20 minutes, 2 men entered the room. The first was unknown, but the second was Colonel Ralphot. Apophis wasted no time in scanning the stranger. Colonel Zariel, rank. Level. Why couldn't Apophis see his information? Could Colonel Zariel be perhaps rank A, or even higher? Apophis was in a terrible situation. Ralphot had betrayed him and seemed to be in league with someone even stronger than Apophis. The 2 men sat down in chairs of their own in front of the chair where Apophis was tied up. After looking uncomfortable for a few moments, Ralphot spoke up. "Sorry for the theatrics, Apophis. The human supremacists are everywhere in society, watching us night and day, because we are one of the few institutions within the Federation which they have not yet compromised. We brought you here not because we desire you any harm, but because we could not afford any risks of discovery. Now, we know that the Grand Admiral has spoken with you, and we would like to know what he told you. Despite Ralphit's attempts to reassure him, Apophis did not answer. Colonel Ralphit understood. Apophis was not the kind of man to cooperate with threats. He had known this, and wished there was another option to arrange this meeting, but could not arrange anything better at such short notice. So, trying to ease the tension of the situation, Ralphit untied Apophis and brought him food and water. Apophis didn't know how long he'd been unconscious, but the first sip of water made him realize he was as thirsty as though he hadn't drunk in days. After draining the glass, he turned to the food, which proved to be a packet containing a variety of odd cookies. Ralphit, hoping Apophis was now in a good mood, said, "I am sorry I have lied to you all this time. In truth, I am a member of the Federation Secret Service, tasked with monitoring Admiral Azeroth. It seems that he discovered my role and so assigned me to keep surveillance on you instead. Given the circumstances, I can never contact Azeroth again, but we know he is planning something important. Apophis, we need your help to stop the human supremacists. We are unaware of the details, but know for certain that he intends a coup against the Chancellor and the Senate." Apophis finally answered with a calm and level voice. "Where is Antanria?" Ralphit removed a round hologram projector from his pocket, which he set on the table between them. An ultra-detailed hologram of Antanria appeared above it. She was asleep in what looked like a comfortable cell with windows. Considerably better than where Apophis had woken up. Apophis stared at it for a few moments, skeptic. This could easily be a trick. "Can I see her?" Ralphit answered, "Everything in turn, my friend. Give us the information we requested, and then we will go to see Antanria in person." Anger burned deep in Apophis's chest. He did not easily forgive people who tried to coerce him, and he had a special hatred for people who betrayed him. Nevertheless, he needed to cooperate for now. Ralphit and Apophis had a kind of understanding between them. Ralphit knew that Apophis had no morals and that his word was meaningless, so Ralphit would take every precaution to protect himself as they dealt with each other. Apophis could probably kill both colonels, even if the mysterious stranger was more powerful than him in some ways. Even if all three of them died in the fight, only one of them would come back afterward. Nevertheless, this was an interesting opportunity, and one that Apophis liked the idea of seizing. In Apophis's old life, the supremacists had failed in their coup. This had led to a civil war within the Federation between the supremacists and the so-called pragmatists. However, things could easily turn out differently in this timeline. The new war with the orcs was totally new, and Azeroth had never been Grand Admiral in the old timeline, instead being forced to play both sides of the civil war to keep his reputation and title of military governor. So Apophis replied, "Azeroth wants me to raise 100 million eternal soldiers to help him in his coup." Chapter 78 Supreme Chancellor. You are listening at novelfull.audio. After Apophis revealed the Grand Admiral's plans, the two colonels shared a glance. The supremacists were actively involved in Federation politics at all levels. Although some of them preferred the path of violence and terrorism to achieve their goals, they were in the minority. The majority preferred the non-violent path of legislation. But neither colonel doubted that Apophis was telling the truth. His testimony was proof of a renegade plot to overthrow the state. The Supreme Chancellor had always made efforts to minimize the capability of the supremacists to divide the Federation, but his attempts had finally failed. Ralphit said, "I will discuss the situation with my superiors." "Thank you for the information, Apophis. Guards will show you Antanria's cell, and we will return shortly." Ralphit and Zariel left the room. But just before they stepped out, Colonel Zariel flicked a piece of paper from his pocket, which fell into the camera's blind spot. Supreme Chancellor's Palace. A few hours later Colonel Ralphit entered a gigantic office. It led onto a balcony, and an old man stood there, smoking. It was Supreme Chancellor Soli, a professional politician through and through. He had spent nearly his entire life engaging in compromise and peacemaking between opposing factions, and his efforts had rewarded him with the most distinguished role in the United Federation of Planets. After a formal greeting, the Chancellor activated a soundproofing shield and motioned for Ralphit to sit down. It must be at least 2 years since we entrusted you with infiltrating the supremacist milieu. Yet, I've received very few reports from you, and those you sent were quite vague. Why such silence? Ralphit opened a bag he had brought with him and removed a stack of detailed, top-secret reports. Here are all the missing reports, sir. Please forgive me for the delay. I am afraid the situation was far more delicate than we had expected. According to my best judgment, transmitting any of these through usual means would have created an unacceptable mission risk. Soli was annoyed, though he knew Ralphit's judgment had usually proved accurate in the past and that his carefulness had been one of the main reasons for sending him on such an important mission. Well, let me see them. What exactly have you discovered? Ralphit passed over the papers and then thought carefully before speaking. The supremacists have infiltrated all areas of society, industry, telecommunications, and, of course, the military. Grand Admiral Azarov is only the tip of the iceberg. I found numerous links in the upper echelons of society to senators and governors who support a coup. I am sorry to report that this likely extends to even people in your government. The Chancellor replied, what you're telling me is what we've known for years. The supremacist ideology has always festered in our society. But in its political and non-violent forms, ones which posed no real risk to our people. Ralphit retorted, that may be true, but the situation has recently changed. It was Grand Admiral Azarov who destroyed the Tayo Protectorate, not the Orcs. He deliberately blamed the Orc Empire, but they are completely innocent in this matter. Grand Admiral Azarov is framing himself as the hero of the Federation, a fearless hero who pushes back aggressive Xeno invaders, but he does not plan to remain in this role for long. The situation is dramatic. That is the truth. If forces that are now in motion do not slow or turn, we will have a civil war in a few weeks. Soli, usually a calm and thoughtful man, was stunned. To a man who had worked his whole life to uphold civil peace, this was hardly believable. He rose violently from his chair and snapped, why didn't you say so before? It's been almost 3 months since the events of Era took place. Because of you, I promoted one of history's most despicable war criminals and called him a hero. Your mission was to inform me of the danger of these supremacists, but your inaction has led me to empower them myself. The colonel answered stiffly, my every movement was watched by a group of Eternals almost from the moment of the travesty against Era, sir. I was required to discern whether these Eternals were under the Grand Admiral's full control before I acted. He thought for a moment before continuing. But I have good news, sir. The leader of these Eternals. I believe I can convince him to join our cause. He may assist us in averting civil war. The Chancellor glared at him. I'm going to make you a general and put you in charge of the Federation Intelligence Service. Then I'll write up the decree for instating emergency law, to purge the terrorist elements from society. We'll fight fire with fire. We can use the Orc threat as cover for our actions, just as the supremacists are planning. This decree will be very controversial. But if the majority of senators oppose it, we may just have to make a coup ourselves. If that is the only way to save the Federation, even I must bow my principles to the survival of society. He shot a steady look at Colonel Ralphit. If such a disgraceful and unfortunate situation arises, Colonel, can I count on your unfailing support? Ralphit understood the situation, that it was an outcome both of them reviled. Yet, he did believe that it might become necessary, and that his excessive caution was partly responsible for it. Sir, I have never failed you, and I do not intend to start now. Chapter 79 Antanria Choice. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Apophis, escorted by 2 guards, finally arrived at Antanria's cell. They unlocked the door, and he entered. Antanria. As soon as the Zetark princess saw Apophis, she threw herself in his arms. "Where were you, Dad? I was so scared for you. All I knew is I was alone, and had not a single clue what was going on. Where are we?" Apophis was disturbed by all this. He wanted to tear the jaws off all the people in the building for what they'd done. L.RG, but he had to play his cards right and make the most of the situation. The universe was full of dangers that would make Colonel Ralphit look like a pathetic child. After all, a cosmic-level threat was coming in a matter of years. Apophis would need to survive now and gain all the power he could if he hoped to defeat it. So for now, Apophis hugged Antanria tightly to his chest, kissed the top of her head, and said, "It's okay now. Daddy's here." Antanria said, "I don't want to be separated like this ever again. I want to be like you, strong enough that I can protect myself. I cannot be just a little girl who hides and waits while you risk your life to protect everyone else. I want you to teach me how to fight, both your own skills and how to use what we found in the Zetark manuals." Apophis was surprised. In the world of Horus, most children across all different cultures took a Halo test at the age of 6 to determine how much energy their body could hold. Those who achieved a certain level of potential were deemed super soldiers or ascensionists in most galactic cultures. It was considered a tremendous blessing to have an ascensionist child, but Apophis knew things would be different for Antanria, a Zetark child. Apophis might be one of the most knowledgeable people alive when it came to Zetark scholarship, but even he knew little about them. Even still, he suspected they didn't give the Halo test to their own children while they were alive. They especially wouldn't have given it to Antanria, a female. No matter their potential, Zetark women were not permitted to fight. Zetark society was deeply traditional in this way and rejected the idea of the progression of women's rights. Apophis replied, "I don't think it'd be a good idea to teach you how to fight. Super soldiers are often trained from a very young age, so you might be too old to make use of the training that's available. Besides, if you started fighting, I'd just worry more. I'm immortal, remember, like the rest of my eternal allies. It's no big deal if we die in battle, because we just come back. But your death would be permanent." Antanria went quiet for a long time before speaking up again. "You know, I lied to you. I do remember what happened at the fall of Auralia, before I was cryogenically frozen." Apophis held his breath. She continued, "Despite the legions of guards protecting us, despite all our defense, one man slaughtered my people and my entire family. We relied on trained guards to protect us, but they failed. It seems obvious to me that relying on others to save you is always a bad idea. So I don't want to just be weak. I want to be useful, like Lotus." Apophis grew more uncomfortable with every word. He had freed Antanria involuntarily, intending to kill her for EXP. If he'd understood how her cryogenic pod worked, he would have simply killed her in a different way. Then, he'd kept her close to him so he could learn more about the Zetark and their science. But now, things had changed a lot. Apophis was no longer simply keeping Antanria around because she was useful to him. Apophis truly loved the Zetark girl like a father does a daughter, and the memory of how he'd almost casually killed her was disturbing to him. He really had changed a lot in only a few months. But their moving reunion was cut short. Someone knocked on the cell door and entered without waiting for a reply. It was Ralphit, with a brand new general's badge hanging from his uniform. Chapter 80 Carelessness. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Ralphit entered the room with a superior air about him. He'd just received the promotion of his life and was filled with confidence and joy, despite the worrying political circumstances. Filled with this attitude, he addressed Apophis. "I need to speak with you in private. Do you mind joining me in a more secure room?" Apophis answered, "Very well, but Antanria comes with me." Ralphit nodded and led them to a huge glass elevator, from which Apophis and Antanria had an incredible view of the huge city-planet of Terra. There were skyscrapers as far as the eye could see, and the atmosphere seemed to shimmer in the trails of all the vehicles passing by. The Secret Service building itself was immense, over 2 kilometers high, and made up of over 300 floors. The building was expensive and housed even more continuous costs, but it was all worth it. In the immense geopolitical jungle of the galaxy, the Federation relied heavily on its intelligence network to maintain power. The 3 former teammates entered a huge room in the basement of the Secret Service building. It was totally soundproof, having been built with the galaxy's finest dampening materials. In the middle of the room lay a vast table made of ancient stone, carved with markings in an unknown language. Ralphit beckoned Apophis and Antanria to sit down, then theatrically spread Apophis's file on the table between them. Multiple homicide, said Ralphit. Looting, unauthorized military expedition, violation of another country's sovereignty, use of unknown and dangerous technology, failure to comply, and finally conspiracy against the state. Your criminal record is impressive, Apophis, especially since you have accomplished all this in just a few months. If you went to court tomorrow, you would never see the light of day again. Nevertheless, I may have a solution for you. While Ralphit was giving this monologue of bullshit, which seemed to be pulled right from all the worst detective movies in history, Apophis was thinking about the message which Colonel Zariel had dropped in his cell. It was a simple phrase in ancient Zetark. Only the black sun Auralia reigns. Unbeknownst to Apophis, this was a phrase which the supremacists used to identify each other, but to Apophis, the message was truly cryptic. He couldn't remember anything about this message or Zariel himself from his first life. However, Apophis had to assume that, since Zariel had been powerful enough to hide all his system information, that he was truly a rank A character. That was the higher power tier before achieving divinity, and Apophis had been pretty certain that he knew the identities of every rank A character at this time. After all, there were only 3 of them. To be rank A was to destroy an entire fleet, army, or city all by oneself. It was the power of a real supervillain. The great space nations cherished these people when they rose among them, seeing them as symbols of national power. But they also watched rank A individuals as closely as they would an unstable nuclear plant. For NPCs, it was almost impossible to achieve rank A power. Only 1 out of a billion people were even born with the potential to achieve it, and the odds of any random person having access to the training and resources to achieve such power were absurd. To complicate matters further, it was nearly impossible for nations to detect individuals with such potential. Any space nation might have several billion inhabitants at once, so they couldn't easily index every single one of their inhabitants, no matter how hard they tried. After 9 years of gameplay in Apophis's first life, only about 20,000 rank A NPCs had ever been indexed. Apophis's train of thought was interrupted when Ralphit leaned in close. What do you say, Apophis? Surely you see what a fantastic deal this is. Apophis was slightly embarrassed to realize he'd missed every detail of the monologue, but didn't let it show. Listen, I think I agree with most of what you are proposing, but the details are just blurring together. Give me a quick summary. Ralphit wasn't expecting such a straightforward response, given what he knew about Apophis. I am offering you amnesty for your crimes, besides a military promotion, if you help us stop the supremacist plot. Apophis nodded. Very well, but I also want diplomatic immunity for Antanria and myself. Not just protection in the Federation, but diplomatic protection outside it. Also, 10 million GC, right away. Ralphit breathed a sigh of relief. That was all. He held out his hand to Apophis. Deal. Apophis grasped his hand. All right, then. What's my first assignment? Ralphit gave a slight smile. You will kill Grand Admiral Azeroth, of course.